we can't just plant our feet firmly on the ground in nuts and bolts land indefinitely and expect to get any sort of new answers here. We're going to have to be brave enough to start exploring this other territory. And you know as well as I do that this landscape includes a lot of destabilizing emotional woo-related components, and we're not even talking about abductions yet. And that, wait till we get to that sort of destination on the map here. It's going to be very, very awkward for many people, and I think it's going to be hard for folks with a conventional expectation of evidence to grapple with these sorts of stories, because they don't conform to a nice, neat, formulaic narrative. They all have a little bit of that subjective quality to them, which is what you and I, of course, as we've discussed many times, that's what you would expect if the world and reality is in fact kind of a byproduct of our mental activity, just like dreams are very...
Life support systems activated. Shield kinetic system online. Aerial propulsion jetpack online. Multi-tool and mining laser attachment operational. User initialization sequence complete. Thermal protection fully. Component repaired. Thermal protection falling. Technology recharge. Technology recharge. Data received. falling. Weather warning. Incoming storm. Temperature levels stabilizing. Temperature levels stabilizing. Temperature levels stabilizing. Technology recharge. Technology recharge.
Individuated and very subjective. So too are experiences that take place within quote unquote reality, and so that's what we should expect to see. And Les, I just want to say and echo what you pointed out. Before you handed it over to me, because I've been wanting to mention this publicly and just haven't. But we tend to think that it's quite funny, honestly, how often we think that here's something that we are doing to capture these craft. We're causing these highly advanced craft to materialize from another dimension, and we're landing it with our minds, and this is us, this is all us, baby. We just unlocked these special superpowers. And very few of us have stopped to question and think, maybe this is in fact a training. Maybe they are training us in order to understand who we really are, what the nature of reality truly is. That it's kind of a program, a coordinated program to help us become awaken to the reality of who we are and how things truly work. And so they're very much still firmly in the driver's seat, and that way of looking at it. They're just trying to goad us along into kind of waking up from our stupor and realizing what we really can do and how reality may actually function.
Absolutely true, and that's certainly the perspective I take. And again, we see signs of this throughout history, and I would say the most inspiring ones are the ones that try to help us realize our potential. And that may indeed be happening here, and they may be sort of going through the motions of making us think that we're all doing this, but they're very much assisting us and helping us advance into this deeper capacity. All right, so let's jump back into, again, what Jake and his team do and what they say. So this is not an isolated occurrence. This is basically something the government has been using for some time now to activate and to engage with these objects. So Jake says certain military/intel units have recruited and trained psionic assets with remote viewing or telepathic abilities. These individuals can supposedly attract or quote-unquote summon UAPs via focused intention or meditation-like state. Machine-based methods also exist, like spatial radio or energy signals, to lure or excite UAPs. Again, it becomes very interesting how we interpret what their experience is. We've heard about the transportation of nuclear assets before and how that seems to trigger their response and their presence. Lou Elizondo talked about that in his book, that he actually proposed a certain action where they were going to do this and potentially lure these in, but I think it was poo-pooed eventually. And of course, we understand that this understanding about psi is central to intelligence activities for quite some time now. We think about what happened at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, with the Stargate project, with people like Russell Targ, people like Hal Puthoff, who are right at the center of investigations into zero-point energy and propulsion for these craft, were also involved in the same kind of psi activities, psi investigations. And the government was not only, as we knew before, using psi and remote viewing and whatnot to try to glean information about the Soviet Union, for instance, but apparently all along they've also been using psionic assets to basically interact with these craft. And I just want to touch on something here because this is important. And this just shows again how sometimes our categories are sometimes, I would say, often insufficient. Because what Jake is talking about here is that the craft itself might seem alive, might be its own kind of consciousness. Now, we also hear some discussion of the small grays, for instance, often being perceived as androids or cyborgs kind of thing, as biological robots. Now, he described them as kind of like soft tissue drones, I think he said at some point. So this is fascinating, and this, I think, again, lends credibility, just like you said earlier, that when people show some trauma, that to you adds credibility to their account. I would say the fact that we're seeing our conceptions, our categories being transcended by the reality of what we're finding lends credibility that this is more likely true. This is real. This is either coming from a sophisticated intelligence that has coexisted alongside us, or has come from some other planet or some other dimension, again, using that as a placeholder, or perhaps that even some of these might be future humans who are coming back where technology, between external technology and consciousness, has collapsed into kind of an integrated fabric now. I've talked about that before. That might be what we're seeing here. But again, to me, it lends credibility to this evidence that we're seeing products. Is that even the right word? We're seeing things, machines. Is that even the right word? We're seeing kind of embodied consciousness seamlessly integrated with technology in such a way that blows apart our understandings, but is exactly what I think we would expect to see if it is something truly sophisticated.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you think about the gap between intelligence here being extremely wide, then how do you bridge the gap? How do you narrow that? And it's a huge challenge, right? One, it assumes that the gap could actually be bridged at all. But if it can be, how do you awaken the human population to the presence of a much higher intelligent species or several species? It's not something you can just plop an object down and be like, well, we're done here. There's a lot more to it than just that technological layer, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that not only with these accounts, but with the accounts that we've heard over the years, right? We have so many experiencer accounts that talk about the strange elements of contact, and that's part of this conversation. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because it's it's frustrating and it feels very subjective, and you feel like you can't put it into a laboratory. But that's not going away, and we're going to have to find ways to have those conversations and hold space for that material, because it's certainly part of what this happens to be.
Something else that came out of this series of interviews, actually, that Jake had, is clues about the organization behind all of this, behind the cover-up, behind how the government has been operating these programs, which, again, I would suggest that's exactly what we should expect to see. Rather than there being one day where disclosure finally happens, what we instead see is a flow, an increasing flow over time of secrets from inside, including how the organization actually worked. So what Jake talked about was organizational chaos and secrecy. So he spoke to a fragmented structure. So rather than there being a single tidy chain of command, Jake described a tangle of compartmentalized private and government programs where aerospace contractors often hold key hardware and data. Of course, we've heard that for a while now. And even high-ranking officials can be left in the dark. So I think this was one of the most compelling and revealing aspects of the interview, was the degree to which this is not well organized from within. And he almost seemed to laugh at the notion that some people in the public have about how this must be one well-oiled machine from top to bottom. Not at all the case. And because there's such an emphasis on secrecy and compartmentalization, siloing as we referred to it in the past, there's very little information that can leak from one side to the other. And very often the people who are, for instance, congressionally in charge of overseeing these programs never even hear about them. And of course, on top of that, like I discussed before, you have possible deniability being in the mix as well, even to the point where Jake talked about even now, when whistleblowers are going before Congress, often the Congress people will send their staffers. So there's one element of plausible deniability between them and this truth, because if they hear it directly, they're now responsible, and if they're called to speak under oath in front of a congressional committee, they have to legally tell the truth. But if their staffer knows the truth and they only hear the parts they want to hear, then they can plausibly deny without incriminating themselves. So this is what's happening. We're seeing this dance happen where this seems to be unraveling from within, but as it's coming out, we're also seeing Congress people dancing with how do they deal with this in terms of both the consequences for our civilization, but also how they handle this as professional politicians.
Yeah, and I just want to add one quick point to that. He mentions how when he went to, I forget, it was a Senate, he gave his testimony in a skiff, and he said, I kind of need some protection here. And they're like, we actually need you to help protect us, because we are equally afraid of the gatekeepers of these programs, and we don't feel comfortable, sticking our necks out too much, because we've been threatened or maybe threatened by these particular groups. So that tells you quite a lot about the role that the secret keepers have in our government and the hold that they have on our officials, and it should make you really question what we've been able to know, how we're able to know it, when we're able to know it, all of those things, because most politicians, just like most people, there is leverage, right? Somebody's got a secret they don't want somebody to know about, and so, or they got family that they want to protect, whatever it may be. And I think, you're seeing that on full display here in what he's recounting. So very, very interesting. It's going to be a wild year.
That is the understatement of the century. But I will also add that one of the things that came up was, again, the way that these psionics would work. Now, there are some challenging aspects to this as well. It's all not sunshine and roses, because there are biological, chemical means to basically attune people to the psionic capacity, and this sometimes has involved children. And Jesse kind of pushed him a bit on this about how comfortable he is with this, because Jake asserted that some programs have used controversial methods like stress inoculation and mind-altering protocols, and in some cases exploited children or impoverished populations who have latent psionic gifts. So he is disturbed by the ethical implications. He did admit that, though he says it's not always forced trafficking, because he's heard of people who willingly participate because they're well compensated and because they feel like it legitimizes their unusual abilities. Now, my take here is that I certainly think that's part of the picture. But unfortunately, when we look back at the history of our government, we see many, many times where they have used people inappropriately, where they have used people to their ends and they don't have much concern at all as to what happens to those people. In fact, even Jake says that his team is often seen as the sacrificial limb, that if things ever get too risky, too hot for the people up top, they will basically just sever the arm of the people who actually have the knowledge. And now there is total plausible deniability because it never happened and the people who have the knowledge are no longer alive. He's aware that's happened. He's been quite concerned over the last few years that might happen to him. He's been basically going to Congress, like you suggested, to get protection from that, only to find them saying, can you offer us protection? Because you claim to be the boogeyman. You're the guy who knows what you're doing. We're just average politicians who are elected here. That in itself is bizarre and kind of just shows you what a comedy of errors it is to some degree. And again, kind of takes apart this notion people have of the big bad government being one big thing that's really well organized. We're seeing anything but being described here by Jake, which I think kind of vindicates perspectives that you and I have shared before in this podcast about the nature of government and how it works. But let's just spend a minute on this issue of women and children being used in these programs, sometimes being compensated. But I just want to make the point here that I'm aware of situations where people have been recruited in and often abused and misused, and basically they're seen as a means to an end. They may be given money temporarily. They may be given a really nice place to stay, which to them is going to seem like immense riches, but then they're often pumped full of drugs to enhance their capabilities. And the kind of drugs that are used, the kind of protocols they go through, I have heard can also quickly deteriorate the human brain. And these people often die quite young as a result and are kind of just cast aside as pawns. And then the next group comes in. And of course, the really sad and tragic part here, and the outrageous part, is that they're going into the developing world and taking these people so that no one will ever know. No one will ever sort of stand up and say, what happened to my son, my daughter, my niece, my uncle, my aunt? These people just disappear, never to be seen again. And because we in the first world have this capacity, we kind of use it for our own ends, and the results be damned in terms of those people. And so often with our government, we've seen this notion that the ends justify the means. And I kind of got the sense, I'm curious to get your sense as well, but I could tell that Jake was a bit uncomfortable, and maybe even a bit of willful ignorance I felt was being engaged with there, because we've heard from other people that some more nefarious things are going on, and based on the history of our government, I think that's the most likely scenario. What's your take on all that?
No, I think that that's very fair, and I think it would be naive to think that there wasn't some sort of abuse in a program like this, that we can say all day long that we're offering them compensation, room and board, and all these great things, and a life away from poverty and horrible conditions, but that just may be the things we say to assuage the guilt that we have for basically enslaving them. And so I think it's a very real possibility. While you were talking, I'm also thinking about the Netflix show Stranger Things, which has Seven is the psi-capable young person in that storyline who was subjected to all the things you just talked about. She was kind of held against her will. She was given drugs. She was traumatized, all to elicit a greater manifestation of her psi ability. And I find that very interesting. Right? That's part of the kind of public conversation in our consciousness now, and how that might bleed over into aspects of reality. Certainly is very plausible, in my opinion. And of course, Jake only has a very narrow picture of one particular program. And so, there, as there are lots of programs that are active, and I'm sure these psionic assets all come in a variety of different forms and are used for a variety of different means.
Yes. All right. So we've ventured into the crossover from the nuts and bolts into the woo a lot in this podcast. We've even delved into some of the spiritual aspects. Now, speaking of recent interviews and the engagement of these kind of topics, we know that Diana Pasulka recently was interviewed on the Sean Ryan show. All sorts of interesting things to get into here that very much dovetail from what we've discussed so far in terms of psionics, psychic capacities, spirituality, multidimensionality, all these things. So basically, Diana talked about the sort of metaphysical superstructure, basically, that surrounds and subsumes our reality, and that people can tap into these realms, if you want to call them that, these states of being through various means, not just through things like psionic activities and perhaps even the beings that we're encountering, the craft we're encountering that we call UAP, that we used to call UFOs, but even through use of psychedelics and things like that, or ancient spiritual rituals, the rituals of certain secret schools in the past, occultic kind of practices. What she's suggesting is that these all access these greater domains, and that it's potentially dangerous to go into those domains. And she certainly seemed to stress the fact that the character of the person, the preparation of the person, plays a big role in that. There's numerous things to break down here, but because Diana was going on to a show of a guy who the host, is a purported evangelical Christian, it's not surprising, I guess, that we veered into more religious territory or spiritual territory. And I saw afterwards Diana commented that she was really happy that she was able to do that, and that people seemed to engage with it. And for the first time, she, in being pressed by Sean, could give her perspective and not just give the standard religious studies kind of perspective. She admitted she does believe in a soul, an eternal soul, and we do need to be wary of that when we get into these kinds of realms and deal with different kinds of intelligences. She goes out of her way to say, this is not the perspective of my university, and this is not what I teach as a religious studies professor, but this is my internal conviction. And part of her experience with the UFO phenomenon over the last 12 years or so has led to that conviction. So a lot to get into here, but give me your initial take on that interview and the matters they went into.
Yeah, I found it to be one of the best interviews that she's done, and I've had a chance to talk to her a couple of times on Calling All Beings. This was really well done. It provided enough long-form time to get into some of these topics in ways that I don't think she's explored publicly before. Particularly because Sean pressed her, and also he seemed personally just fascinated by elements of the Catholic tradition and her understanding of those things, her understanding of the Bible, pushing her into kind of addressing her personal opinion on that, and also her academic opinion on those subjects. I think was really, really useful. There's a whole lot to say, I think, about that conversation. One of the things that I'll start off with noting is she talks about we talk about realms and sort of cognitive sovereignty, I think is the phrase that she uses. There's a famous levitating saint, Saint Teresa of Avila. She's known to be going through these moments of levitation. And if you want to read more about that, there's a great book called They Flew by Carlos Ayer that I'm currently reading. It gets into that account. But one fascinating thing about Teresa's experiences, is one, she's recounting those experiences autobiographically, but also she has the sort of those who are interrogating her experience at the same time, because the Catholic Church wanted to promote authentic experience and not just kind of pick up anybody's fantastic story and then all of a sudden they just become a saint. They really kind of drilled people and asked their colleagues, and is this stuff actually happening or is it not happening? But one of the fascinating things about Teresa's experience is she didn't want them to happen. She was levitating, and she actually didn't want that to happen. So this notion of our cognitive sovereignty, or us being able to will something to not occur just because we don't want it to occur, because we don't want to engage with it, I think is challenged a little bit from this one account, and that's certainly from other accounts that we know of in the experiencer literature. Most of the experiencers that I know that had a very traumatic experience, they had a lot of will to not encounter this and to not engage with it, but they didn't have a choice. And so you can see them very publicly wrestle with that component of how the line between free will, and that intersection between non-human intelligence is very blurred and quite confusing. And so I think that that's something worth exploring there. I certainly appreciate her perspective that she doesn't want to willingly experience a download or navigate into those other realms. But I kind of question the degree to which we have a tremendous degree of control over exactly how those experiences play out, or at least we kind of fool ourselves into thinking how much control we may actually have. So that's just one aspect of the conversation I found really interesting. There's a whole host of other ones to get into. But what's your take on that, or what else jumped out for you initially in that conversation?
Well, what comes to mind when I hear what you just said there is that that's well put, and I would say that again, the question is, do we make a mistake by assuming this is all kind of one thing? We put it into one bucket. And may it be the case that we do have some degree of cognitive, and I would say spiritual or energetic sovereignty, but in some situations, in a certain refraction of our being, it might appear that we don't. I think that comes in here as well. The segment that I'm going to speak as part of this panel at Archives of the Impossible is on the ethics of contact, and that's one of the things we'll get into. And one of the issues we've wrestled with in the John Mack Institute is this notion of the multidimensional self and even multidimensional ethics. And this is right at the heart of our conversation today, because we're talking about the spiritual, energetic, the woo, right, overlay here. And part of that not only reframes how we think about them, but it reframes how we think about ourselves. And in the same way that they're perhaps trying to encourage and inspire us to step into greater capacities we have in terms of psionics, they also, again, the more benevolent ones, frequently try to remind us about who we truly are and our true capacities. And that involves things like a higher self, that we exist on this kind of hierarchy of fractals. And that, of course, changes how we think about agency, how we think about things like human rights. I sometimes hear people kind of understandably debate whether or not this is basically felonies that are being committed here. I know that Luis Elizondo has said this, kidnapping, assault, things like that. But many of the experiencers, while it's true what you said, that some people have had negative experiences that would not want to have them again if they had the choice, there are other people who begin not liking it so much, but then come into this awareness that they did have a part to play, and they remember at a different level of themselves, if you will, agreeing to this, and actually this being part of a larger plan, which again points to the fact that not only are they different than we sometimes conceive, but reality itself, this integrated, interpenetrating series of mindscapes, if that's what reality is, then that completely throws disclosure on its head. And this is why I've so often said, the part about disclosure that seems problematic to me is, where do you know where to stop? How can you just let it out a little bit? It's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. How do you do that exactly? Because the implications for the nature of reality, the nature of ourselves, who we truly are, life and death, all of that is wrapped up in this. So that's what I think about with that. That's going to be a very interesting conversation that we're just barely beginning to crack the surface of at this point. But something else that Diana talked about was Plato's Republic and Plato's Cave. This is something that comes up a lot in her interviews. She really likes this kind of metaphor. And it was also very interesting to see her get into this, because she saw her being very impassioned about this, because it wasn't just some notion from the past or some, loose approximation. She seemed very convicted around the notion that we are being controlled, that we are being subject to a control structure, which very much dovetails with my most recent POC episode, where I talked about that as well. So she's basically saying, we are seeing the shadows on the cave, and we are assuming that's reality, but it's not. And she also made the point that that's being done purposefully, which of course then led Sean to ask the question, okay, Diana, then who are the puppet masters? So what did you think about that, and how would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, I was cheering him on because I asked her the exact same question when she came on to our show. So I really wanted her to address who those puppet masters were, and had a hard time getting her to answer that. I was very interested in her faith story. I didn't know that. I knew that she had grown up in a secular house, but I didn't know the degree to which she had such a strong conviction turning to her faith at a young age. I think she had essentially kind of a calling, a very strong calling to pursue this path, this academic path, and she has devoted her life to that. And I find that really interesting, and it feels like she has protected her faith very, very strongly. And so when you get into questions about who's who's the puppet master, who's the deceiver, essentially. Think of it from that perspective. I think that might be useful. Who's the deceiver deceiving those of us who are in the cave into thinking that we are seeing reality when we are not? Well, from the lens of a Christian perspective, there's really only one deceiver, right? Then the deceiver would be Satan, the adversary of God, right? And of course, then you bring in the notions of demons and other entities that are against the forces of good, of course, against the forces of God and angels, etc. And the conversation absolutely veers into that territory. Like you said, we can't seem to shake the angels and demons component in the UFO conversation. And for you and I, we spent a great bit of time discussing that. It is frustrating because I think it's too narrow of a frame to consider all of this. As you talked about in your response to my comments, and thinking about the fact that the dissociative boundaries between our conscious expression, what we know as you and I, and the non-human intelligence conscious expression, the boundaries between those things aren't as impermeable as we like to think. There's a great deal of bleed over. If all of this is in fact all of us, then anything that we actively shun, I don't want to have an experience, I don't want to download, I don't want to know this or that, that only grows the shadow aspect of ourselves and kind of opens us and exposes us to the components of reality that are still very much there, that we must incorporate into who we are, because it ultimately is part of us. And so by just pretending that it's not there doesn't in fact make it go away. So yeah, it's a long answer to your question, but I think it was very revealing about her personal beliefs, and this puppet master question in particular, I think, veers often into some territory that I get where we're going there, but I also am a little bit frustrated that it tends to be narrowly defined by kind of the forces of good and evil.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's probably a good place for us to just sort of close out this episode around, because at one point Sean sort of states it plainly, right? He says that when I look at it, it kind of looks like this is all about angels and demons. And he literally means it's all about angels and demons, meaning every movement, every machination in society now and across time has really been about the battle between these two opposing forces, these very binary forces, good versus evil, light versus dark. And he even calls it demonic. Now, to Diana's credit, I would say, she says, well, that's your term. I would maybe use a different term. But she is suggesting that, and I think this is what she really wanted to highlight, was that there's more than meets the eye going on, basically. And we need to look to these deeper metaphysical matters to understand what's happening here. And that I would say part of us as human beings sort of advancing into, growing into, expanding into this more transcendent view of ourselves actually gets us in touch with those metaphysical matters, and then we can access more of our agency. Part of the legacy, unfortunately, of physicalism is it makes us believe none of that's even real. So not only do we not access our agency, but we're easily duped and manipulated because we're not even accounting for it, we're not even checking for it. So I think that's really important here. But to your point, absolutely agreed, and I made this point on social media yesterday, that the binary framing, though, is the problem. And this is what I said in regards to that particular matter. I said, quote, acknowledging there is a spiritual component to UAP is essential, but spiritual, quote unquote, doesn't equal flat good versus evil. That's why reducing the landscape to angels and demons, quote unquote, isn't helpful even as a placeholder, because that misrepresents the spectrum-like nature of consciousness, unquote. So that's what I would say if I was in that conversation, because I do think we need to be aware of these matters. We do need to be aware of the multidimensional self and the fact that we are subsumed by this larger reality. But reducing it to binary is actually, I think, in the long term, does more harm than good.
Yeah, I think put it there myself. That's really well put. I hope we get to explore that further. I think that's a really important component of this conversation. This notion of spirituality itself is also really important. In some ways, I think we've done ourselves a disservice by even introducing that term, because it creates this bifurcation of things that are quote-unquote spiritual and things that are quote-unquote scientific. We tend to have these demarcations, and I honestly don't think they're actually very useful, because it is all one thing. And so that is in part where that these notions really harm the conversation, and we've got to do a lot of work to, I think, retcon the human experience away from that split. So the work lies ahead for all of us who are trying to do that. So yeah, really solid conversation. I know we covered a lot of ground on this episode. I'm sure that'll be the end of cool things happening in UFOs for the next few weeks. We'll just have to catch up next time and talk about our favorite, recipes over the first quarter of the year. But no, I think it's going to be very interesting. I think that what Barbara has done will embolden other whistleblowers, that these conversations are happening in more and more public spaces, more and more high-profile podcasts. And I think those of us who've been championing this for a while may feel a little frustration in that, but also we should be celebrating it, that these conversations are spilling out into the mainstream and provide opportunities for us to engage with our family and friends in these very important topics. So on that note, thank you all for listening and joining us on this show. And may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames. Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Darren King, also known as Exo-Academian. You're listening to episode 66, Route 66. We're here to have some fun today and talk about a lot of interesting things that have been happening since we last talked just 3 weeks ago. Darren, you and I have remarked how much is going on and how it's hard to even keep track of it all. Just every single day there's some sort of interesting news cycle happening, both politically and in ufology, in other areas that intersect with ufology. So it's quite an interesting time to be plugged into this topic, and it's fun to talk about, really. I look forward to these conversations because there's just so much to get into and to unpack that has been happening in the day-to-day cycle. But before we get into all that, of course, I want to check in with you, see how things are going in your neck of the woods. For folks who aren't as familiar, Darren does, in fact, live in the woods in a nice, cute little cabin. And so when I'm asking him that, it is, in fact, the truth. What is happening in your neck of the woods? How are things?
Things are very good, and I absolutely enjoy living in my little neck of the woods here. I have lived in 7 different states, 3 different countries, 2 continents, and I wouldn't choose anywhere else.
Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with MyLowe's Rewards. Earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at Lowe's.com/terms. Subject to change.
With new McValue at McDonald's, you always get more than you expect every day. So even if gas prices go up, you can buy a double cheeseburger and add a McChicken for $1. Or before game time, you can get $5 meal deals for the group. And if breakfast is about to end, get deals in the app to save before the bell. The choice is yours, and the choice with McValue is always more.
Prices and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value. Must opt into rewards for app deals.
Diana Pasulka, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's an honor to have you here. I've been trying to get you here for quite a while now, and I just got I don't even remember the first person that introduced me to kind of what you're doing, but I've been getting hit from all angles.
Wow,
and,
really?
Yeah, definitely. And I've been really looking forward to this interview. I grew up Catholic. I'm into UFOs. I can't wait to dive in here. So I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So I just want to say thank you for making the time and
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely.
So, but let me give you a quick introduction here.
Okay.
You're a writer, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. You have authored a series of books, including American Cosmic UFOs, Religion and Technology, Heaven Can Wait, Purgatory in Catholic Devotional Culture and Encounters, Experiences with Non-Human Intelligences. You've been a guest on several prominent podcasts such as the Joe Rogan Experience and the Lex Friedman podcast, and you've served as consulting producer on the Emmy Award-winning Netflix series Encounters. You are also the religion consultant on The Conjuring and was featured in the J.J. Abrams docuseries UFO. You spent your career teaching and writing about American religious history and Catholic history, including studying at the Vatican Archive. Sounds fascinating. Your research connects religion, technology, and now the enigmatic realm of the UFO phenomena. Now you find yourself working with scientists and military personnel on the topic, something you never thought you'd be doing when you began your career. And you're a Christian believer and a mother, probably the most important things, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
So everybody starts off with a gift.
Oh, right. Wow. Thank you.
A little something for the ride home.
Oh, thank you for giving me two because I have a lot of kids. So
We'll give you some more. We'll give you some.
they'll love this. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think my son wanted me to have a gun, but I don't know about that.
Do you want a gun?
No, I'm just joking.
All right. Well, Diana, we were just having a conversation right before we started recording, and I was going to start this interview in the year of 2012, but it sounds like you had an experience as 11-year-old girl.
That's right.
So
Yes.
let's start right there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so it was when I was 11 that I decided to do what I'm doing now, which is looking at religion, but most specifically then, I wanted to read the Bible, which I did. So I had an experience. So in my upbringing, my parents were secular, right, Christian, right? So that means that we didn't have a Bible in the house. We celebrated Christmas, and that type of thing. So I had never read the Bible, and I didn't actually know the story of Jesus. I knew, of course, Jesus Christ. Everybody does, but I actually didn't know the story. So it was on an Easter, and I was, doing Easter eggs at the table, and the TV was on, and Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth was on the TV. So I was somewhat watching it, but not really paying attention, and I was, doing the Easter eggs. And at some point, there was the scene where the mob is just about to kill this woman. So there's this mob of men, and it's this woman who's an adulterer, and they're going to stone her to death. And of course, it's super dramatic. And I'm, doing the Easter egg, and I look at that, and Jesus is writing something in the sand, and I'm like, well, he's got to stop this. This is terrible. And so he looks up and he says, "Those among you with sin cast the first stone." And that converted me somehow. Somehow, to me, that was something that reversed the law, because it was the law that she be stoned. But he reversed it. And I thought, I was a pretty serious kid, and I knew that, people did bad things, and, there was bad in the world. So to me, this could be something. I thought this was hopeful. This was like a person who provided some type of hope. So I decided that I'd watch the show, because it started on Friday, and I believe that was probably Friday night, and kept going on Saturday, and then ended on Sunday, Easter Sunday. And so I kept watching, and my parents thought it was strange because they never really cared about that stuff before. But every day I woke up and I was like, I'm gonna watch this show tonight. And now this sounds ridiculous, but it's actually true. I didn't know that he was crucified at the very end. So at the very end, he gets crucified, and to me it was devastating, because I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, he actually provided some hope to these people, and now he's being crucified. So my mom was observing this and thought it was really strange. I had tears. And so the next day, I made my mother take me to a Bible store to buy the Bible. She didn't know what to get, so we asked the clerk, this is my first Bible. In fact, it's our only Bible. What should we get? So we got this red letter edition of the King James Version of the Bible. And the red letter edition, for people who don't know, it's the edition that has Jesus's words all in red. And to me, that was exactly what I wanted. So we got the red letter edition. I brought it home, started reading it right away from beginning, right? Now, you have to understand that my grandparents were Catholic, right? So they had Bibles, but my parents were just agnostic. They didn't go to church, right? So I started to read the Bible, and immediately I could tell that it wasn't an easy read. Okay, it's not an easy read. For anybody who just cracks it and decides, okay, what does this book really say? It's hard to read. So some parts were easy to read, like the red letters, right? Easy to read. But like the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, Genesis, that kind of thing, I could tell that it was an ancient text. And so I made it my goal then. I became Christian. So I decided I'm a Christian. I don't know what my parents are, but I am now. And, I asked my parents to take me to different churches, whatever church was a Christian church. I was 11. Mm-hmm. So it was a full-on religious conversion that I had that I didn't recognize until later. And I said, I want to grow up, and I want to go to school or whatever needs to happen so that I can read this book in its original language, because I could tell it had been translated. And so I finally got that. I did it. So that's what I did. It was a rocky kind of trip there, but I finally went to a Catholic school, which is where at that point nuns were running the school, so it was a really good school. I graduated really early when I was 16. I did go to college, and then I went to the Jesuit School of Theology, which is a school where you can do an academic degree with priests. So priests were my peers. So I went to school with priests in formation to be priests. So I got an education that priests get. And then after that, I got my PhD, and I've been doing this ever since, so.
Wow, so you literally started at age 11.
Yeah, I still have the same Bible too.
Man, that's crazy. That's awesome. I mean, it's pretty profound for an 11-year-old to
yeah, it did freak my parents out, to tell you the truth. They thought it was odd, but my father was more okay with it. He's passed away. But my mother, I felt like she was worried about me. She thought maybe she thought I'd become a nun. And I actually know nuns, and they're good people, and I keep thinking that's not the worst case
There's
scenario.
Definitely worse career paths than being
exactly.
a nun.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I know that, so as I mentioned, I grew up Catholic.
Yep.
And and still go back every now and then. We've got a lot of questions. But you started studying purgatory in 2012. And so could you describe purgatory for the audience, for the people that don't know?
You bet, sure. So I started it earlier than that. So it was something that I started as soon as I became an assistant professor. And this was in 2002, 2003. And in order to keep that job, you have to publish, which is normal for a professor. So I was interested in, ideas of the afterlife and the soul. These things interested me. And in the Catholic tradition, which is what I was trained in, there's this thing called purgatory. And this is also Eastern Orthodox. So most Christians that are not Protestant believe in this thing called purgatory. And it's like a way station for souls that aren't good enough to go to heaven. Okay. So if you are a normal person, not the best person, but not the worst person, you're not going to hell, right? So you go to this place called purgatory where it's supposed to be a place of purgation where you work off your sins and then that soul goes to heaven. Well, this was a doctrine of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And it somehow went away. So it's still a doctrine, but Catholics don't know about it and they don't pray for souls that are in purgatory anymore. It used to be a huge devotion. And I wanted to know why it disappeared. So I started to do archival research. So archives are are libraries of old manuscripts and books from ancient times to the present. And there's some really great archives in the United States and, of course, at the Vatican. So I started to look in these archives for what Catholics in 1200 and 1300, throughout time, thought of purgatory, basically. And as I was doing that work, I was looking, I was writing a book, like a survey of purgatory. Well, it turns out purgatory was actually a place in Ireland. So there's actually a place, it's still there. It's on a plate on an island called Loch Derg, which is Red Lake, the Red Lake in Ireland. And it was a place where people thought that they could go to a cave, and if they withstood it for 24 hours, their souls would be cleansed after that. And they did this in the late medieval time period till about 1200. So it became a
So
doctrine.
they thought that if they could handle being in a cave for 24 hours,
Yeah.
is there anything substantial about this particular
Yeah,
cave?
yeah. So this cave would have demons and things like that in it. So you have to survive being assaulted by beings of the afterlife in this cave like this. So for the medieval mind, they don't separate out like demons and angels and stuff. Those were part of their reality. So this cave was the place where they could go to an underground area where they could have these battles. And if they survived those battles, their sins would be forgiven. And that's not the only purgatory cave. There was one in Italy as well. So this was where the doctrine kind of like emerged from. And then it became an actual doctrine. And then as time went on, people started to think of it not as a place, but as a state of being. So that's how purgatory changed. And I wrote that book. So I wrote that book. But during the study of that book, I came upon aerial phenomena. So Catholics from 1200 up to 1800 saw things in the sky that they couldn't identify. If they did identify, usually you could see it right in the reports too. They're like, we saw this orb. We don't know what it is, but we think it's a soul from purgatory. So we're going to pray it back to where it should go. And so I started to collect these. Sometimes they saw things and they interpreted them as like flying houses, things in the sky. Sometimes they saw things and they thought they were angels. And so I had a lot of these and I didn't understand what they were. So I kind of put them aside and I wrote my book on purgatory and I got that all done, right? And so I had all of these things and I was on to my next book, by the way, about a Catholic bishop. So I wasn't really going to write about those things, but I still thought that they were weird enough and there were so many of them. The patterns were the same. So I showed a friend of mine and he looked at them and he said, these look like Steven Spielberg films. They look like UFOs. And honestly, I thought he was crazy, and I was like, no way, those are not UFOs. But a UFO conference was happening in my town that week, so we went to that. And that's where I met people who had sightings of UFOs, and it looked like a pattern match. So when I heard them talk about this, and I was like, this looks exactly like the Catholic reports. That's when I began to do this study into UFOs. That happened in 2012.
Before we go into the UFO stuff, I'm actually very interested in the purgatory
Yeah,
stuff.
absolutely,
So
yeah.
what do you think?
Okay.
So the purgatory originated as a cave?
Well,
As
that was
a
one of
couple of
its
caves.
that was one of its practices. So if you look at the Catholic like history of purgatory, the kind of like official idea, it basically says Catholics, we don't know. The Pope would say, we don't know what it is.
I'll admit it, before Shopify, running my business was tough. Figuring out how to market and sell products, fulfill orders, keep track of shipping and transaction records, not to mention creating a website, Shopify made all of that super easy. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet, and the not-so-secret, Shop Pay can boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through. If you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month for a 3-month trial period at shopify.com/SRS, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/SRS to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/SRS.
Technology recharge.
Exciting and new. Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever. It's alive!
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
They tend to try to say it's not a physical place where these souls end up, right? But they don't know what it is. Is it a spiritual place? They tend to say it's a state of mind or a state of being. So I would look at it like a state of being for the soul.
So it's a realm.
Yeah, like a realm, like another dimension or something like that. We would call it, like when you and I talk, I'd say, Sean, it's another dimension. You know, it's another dimension. My soul hopefully will go there. You know, I'm not saying I'm good enough to get into heaven, right? But I'm hoping for purgatory kind of thing. Like that's what, because I believe in the soul. I also want to say this, that I should have said this earlier, that the things that I'm going to say are my own opinion based on what I've studied and how I've lived, and they don't reflect my university. So my university is a state university. It's not going to be, you know, I won't be publishing a peer-reviewed paper talking about the reality of the soul, but I believe in it. So I'm a believer, absolutely.
So you believe in purgatory?
Probably not like it's described by the Catholic Church. I believe that the soul continues, and I believe that and by the way, this is based on not just what I see in Catholicism. I do comparative religious studies. So what I've read stuff from ancient Egypt, and I've read stuff from Hinduism, you know, and Buddhism, things like that. What almost everything I read about within these religions, and people too that I've spoken with. So, you know, I have a lot of friends who have PhDs in various fields, and I ask them, you know, about what they know about this. It appears that this even goes back to Plato, by the way, and Socrates. This is the Greek tradition, the philosophical tradition. What happens to a soul after it dies, you know, after the body dies, is determined largely by what one does in one's life. So I take that very seriously.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Does the Bible is purgatory anywhere in the Bible? Is there anywhere in
No, the word purgatory is nowhere in the Bible. It actually wasn't even codified until the 1200s. So that's late. So Jesus dies in 30. Well, heck, that's like a long time after Jesus's. But there are references to praying for souls that presumably are in another place in the Bible. So there are references to that, but it's not called purgatory.
What is it called?
So there's in the book of Daniel, there's references to prayers said for souls that have passed on. And there are also, I'm trying to remember in the New Testament where this is. I will have to give that to you because for some reason I used to know it, but
Okay.
not. But yeah, but no, in the Bible, there's nothing that references purgatory.
So I got another question for you. If it's not in the Bible, should we be paying attention to it at all?
Okay, so if it's not in the Bible, should we be paying attention?
Because there's
to
a
it
lot of
as
I can't really
Christians?
think of anything like off the top of my head. This is all kind of new to me.
Yes, of course.
You know, like you said at the beginning, I can't even remember if this was on or off camera, but you were most Catholics don't even know their own religion.
Yeah, I know it's
That's
true.
me.
It's kind of sad.
But that's a lot of us. But which is kind of why, you know, part of the reason why I stepped away and started looking for other sources. But you know, I've been talking to a lot of people about God, Jesus, the Bible, and you know, it seems to be there's a lot of little things that different religions believe in that have absolutely no reference in the Bible.
Okay, so I will tell you what I think, Sean. You may not like it. Okay? There are things that are not in the Bible that we should pay attention to. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that. So remember when we talked about how purgatory was codified in the 1200s? The Bible wasn't even codified until the 4th century. So this is going to be 300 years. To be more conservative, this is going to be 200 years after Jesus dies. So the early Christians, they did not have a Bible. Okay, they didn't have what you and I have, what I was so interested in when I was 11. And when you start to do biblical scholarship, like really get into, and I want to preface this too, in religious studies, we don't have an agenda. So we're not advocating a religion or any religion. We study it. And this was as clean as I could get when I decided to do this, because I was like, I just want to know. Like, I'm interested in this guy, Jesus, and I want to know what life is like for him and his followers. And so that entailed doing biblical scholarship. And in where I went to school, which is this place called the Graduate Theological Union, which is the divinity school of UC Berkeley, there are every kind of Christian denomination is there almost. So you've got, Episcopal, you got Catholics, you got every kind of Catholic, Dominican, Franciscans, and you also have people affiliated with UC Berkeley. So you take classes there if you go there too. And so in this environment where priests are taking courses and people who are going to be ministers in the Anglican Church and, they're all taking courses, Presbyterians, and they're all taking what's called New Testament. And in New Testament, you learn how the Bible was put together. And I remember taking this class, and there were lots of people in it, like 35 people. Every single one of those people was going to be some type of theologian minister. I think I was the only one who was going to be an academic. Every single one of those people went through trauma taking that, because because you're brought up to believe a certain story about Christianity. And when that story gets deconstructed in such a way where the teachers using the language of the Bible, which was Greek. The New Testament was Greek, written in Greek, and basically showing you how it was put together, what we have and what we don't have, what other books were out there being used by Christians. This destroyed a lot of people's faith. And I know people whose faith was destroyed. Some of them went on to be scholars of religion because they had that much training. They're like, well, I got to put this degree to use, even though I'm no longer a believer. I met priests whose faith was destroyed, priests in formation. My faith was strengthened. My faith was strengthened because God is a God of truth. And I was like, I am not afraid to know what is the truth. It's not going to make people happy, but I will learn it. And if it's wrong, I'll learn that it's wrong. So when I learned these things, I wanted to know more. So I actually extended my education beyond my PhD. So when I got my PhD, I wanted to study with John Dominic Crossan, who was at that time the foremost scholar on Jesus in the world. And he was teaching at Berkeley. And so I asked the chair of my department if I could take courses with him. And he was like, yes, absolutely. So I got to take courses with him and learn more. And again, it just made me stronger in my faith, stronger Christian, a better teacher, for students. And I have had students who've come through and they've been what are called biblical literalists. So a biblical literalist is a person who takes the Bible literally. It's hard to take it literally because there are discrepancies in it, which is what I knew when I was 11. I was like, this doesn't seem that God would create something that had discrepancies in it. This must be translated wrong or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's what I thought. So I've had students who went on to be ministers of very conservative Christian faith, but we're still great friends. And we would have the conversation about Jesus, with the demon and Legion, that story where Jesus comes to a town and there's a demon-possessed man, and the demon speaks to Jesus and says, "Get away, my judgment isn't here yet." And Jesus gets the demon and makes it go into these pigs, right? And thus saving this man of being possessed. And so I would read this in a certain way, and my student would read it absolutely literally. And we would have a disagreement about it. And then we were still good friends. And he would go on. And I would say, that's fine, as long as you know that I'm teaching it this way. And, if you know that, I'm okay with you having your opinion about it, as long as you know that this is how scholars view it at this point. So we would disagree, but he would go on to be a minister. Now, what's funny is that I've come to his perception of that after 10 years and going through the UFO thing. I'm like, I think he was right. And
Wow.
if he's watching this, I believe you now.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that aren't in the Bible that we should be paying attention to? Are you talking about maybe what's that? Is it the Book of Enoch?
So there are things that haven't been written down, okay? Mm-hmm. But we know about them through material culture. So we know a lot about Christianity by what they decided to put, see these beautiful paintings that you have in here? Well, I know a lot about you by looking at those paintings, right? I know that your friend painted them. I honestly thought that they were photos. That's some artistic talent right there.
Yeah.
But what that means is that what is most important to us, we tend to make images of. And so the early Christians, not all of them could read or write. So they had material culture, and you see these in the catacombs. And so this is where they buried their dead, and they hid out because they were being persecuted by Rome. And so they had a lot of these things that are basically called frescoes. And if you look at their frescoes, you could see what was important to them and also how they worshipped. So you see that they were diverse. So women worshipped with men. Okay, so there wasn't this strict, gender separation. That didn't appear. There are some written things that we should pay attention to. And some of those things we found only in the 20th century because we still do archaeology. So we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tell us a lot about the early Jewish community that became Christian, because Jesus is Jewish, so he's in a Christian. He's not Christian. He's Jewish. So his community. Then we have to understand it in its context in terms of what he said and the message that he brings down. He also talks a lot about the Holy Spirit. What did he mean by that? He meant the presence of God. And I think that is super important. And that's something, by the way, that I believe still is alive. And you could feel the presence of Jesus in certain communities that profess their, devotion to him and profess to do his, what he asked us to do, love one another, those kinds of things. So that's not in the Bible, right? Although it can be, we could use the Bible to help us, create this community of believers. He also instituted a community of people to carry on what he was doing. That community had some books that we've just found out about in the 1940s. And one of the, let's understand too, in the first century, the early Christian church was almost decimated by Rome. Okay, so it's a church that had been, bad things were happening to Christians and to Jewish people. Their temple was destroyed by Rome in 70. So that group dispersed and tried to survive. So that's how they started to write things down, because they couldn't keep an oral tradition alive. Mm-hmm. So they started to keep it going, like, this. So they wrote things, and some of those things we just found. They utilized, and this is really important too, they utilized the Plato's Republic. So the early Christians used Plato's Republic too, which is a really amazing book. And if you haven't read it, you should, it's a hard book to read. It's very much like the Bible because it's ancient. But it tells a very important truth. And so it seems like Socrates and Plato were also onto this one God, right, of justice and truth. And that was somehow separate from their government. Their government was not just and truthful. And so they wrote a book about it called Plato's Republic. When I say they, Plato wrote it, but Socrates didn't write anything. So Plato wrote it. But that was being used by the early Christians. So what was important for them is important for me to know. So I want to know. I'm not trying to tell anybody what to think. I am not the minister of a church. I'm not trying to advocate. But the way I do my, and listen, I'm Catholic, but that doesn't mean that, the Catholic Church, if I'm not a representative of the Catholic Church. And I know a lot of people who are Catholic. And I look at to see what people do. Right? Mm-hmm. What do they do? And if I think what they're doing seems really good and righteous to me, I like that. And I listen to them.
Okay. I had asked a lot of people about Ezekiel.
Yes.
And it sounds like you have an explanation I'm looking for.
Yes.
Can you go into that?
I can.
Please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you're talking about Ezekiel's wheel, right? Mm-hmm. So the Ezekiel's wheel is today. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what I know about it from a Christian perspective. So it's in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's a prophet. Okay, so the Bible, this is the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It is written in Hebrew. And this is the beginning of the Israelite community, okay? So there's Genesis, that describes the story of God kind of having a covenant with these men, all right, to create his people, okay? And that's the book of Genesis. And there's some angel accounts in that too, I think, that are really interesting and we could talk about. So we get to the history of the Jewish people and you get to the prophets. So about Egypt. So they're in Egypt and they have to leave and Moses gets them out of Egypt. And so terrible things happen to them in Egypt. And so they need to leave. So they do. And then you get to a certain part of the Bible. It's like a history of the Old Testament is like a history, okay, of God's people. And so then they get to the prophets. Okay, so the prophets, Ezekiel is one of the prophets. And again, there's a government, there's Babylon, who's basically trying to control the Jewish people, and it's not good for them. So Ezekiel offers hope and as a prophet of God. And what happens to him is that he has this, what some would call a vision, but it could very well, because this is what happens when people have encounters today, say with UAP or what they consider to be angels or something like that. They can't tell if, and you see this also with Paul in the New Testament, when he sees Jesus, he says, I don't know if it was like a dream or if it was real. I cannot tell. So it's a very confusing thing that happens to Ezekiel, but it's called Ezekiel's vision, okay? But I'm sure he thought it was real, and it seems real, okay? So he has a waking dream, maybe, or a vision that appears real. And it's of these beings that look odd. They have wings and they also have wheels associated with them, okay? And this is in chapter 1, so it's at the very beginning. And he has this, and what it does is it gives him the realization that God's people will continue even though they're being pretty much decimated by the Babylonians. Okay, so the Babylonians are putting them in exile and they're kind of breaking them up. And he has this vision of these beings who impart this knowledge to him. Now, that is part of a mystical tradition within Judaism that I've talked, when you're in my field, you get to have friends who have PhDs in areas that you don't. So that's basically one of the best things about what I do, in my opinion. I like it. I get to go talk to friends who are expert at New Testament and say, is this tradition in the New Testament? And yes, apparently it is. Now, these people won't say this publicly, so I'm going to say it. But it's called this, Sean. Ezekiel saw what's most likely a seraphim.
What?
A seraphim.
A seraphim.
Yeah, it's a seraph. So seraphim is like the plural of seraph. It's an angel. It's a type of angel. And you've seen it before, this. It's like the eye with the wings around it, okay? And sometimes it's shown with wheels. And so Ezekiel interpreted this, and other Jewish people interpreted this to be the throne of God, right? The very throne of God. Like these were the beings at the throne of God. And this tradition is called the Merkabah tradition. And Merkabah is literally chariot. So it's a tradition of sightings of these beings that are God's angels. And by the way, so this happens to Ezekiel. And so it then begins this new era for Jews who at this time are in exile, hope that things are going to get better. Okay, so hope that things are going to get better. Before that, there was an interesting angel encounter that Jacob had. So Jacob is one of the people who is the son of one of the patriarchs of the covenant in Genesis. And he has this encounter. He's going to meet his brother. And it's probably not going to be a good meeting because they have a rivalry.